Hello and welcome back, SBL exam preparers. This is the next video, the topic explainer video, and this one is on governance and board committees. My name is Ashim Kumar, and I'm an expert SBL tutor for the ACCA. Today we are going to talk about governance and board committees, and it is a very regular topic in the SBL examination, so we need to be experts on how this fits together. So let's start by asking, what is corporate governance? Well, I like the Investopedia definition. It's very comprehensive. It says it's about balancing the interests of a company's many stakeholders, which can include shareholders, senior management, customers, suppliers, and so on. So it's about looking after a variety of stakeholders, and immediately we see an overlap between governance and stakeholders. And stakeholders, of course, you're all expert at, who are our key stakeholders, which ones do we need to keep happy, and so on. Mendelow's matrix comes to mind. Let's continue. As such, corporate governance encompasses practically every sphere of management, from action plans and internal controls. And notice that internal controls links to another video in this series where I talk specifically about that, and also a third one where I talk specifically about risk. So again, you see an integration of these topics. To performance measurement and corporate disclosure. So basically, corporate governance is about everything to do with both internal and external running of the organization to protect the shareholders and, as always, to achieve corporate objectives. So, for clarity, I've put the aims of corporate governance here together, and you'll see they're very, very similar to the aims that I have for risk and internal control. The overriding aim of corporate governance is to achieve the corporate objectives and to protect the interests of shareholders. Both of these we've already spoken about. And thirdly, to comply with legislation and regulation. So, for example, the production of financial statements is ultimately the responsibility of the board of directors. Okay, so everything is about these three areas. Now a bit of background really about the board of directors. Now, as we've already seen, the board of directors is not the only component of corporate governance, but it is that component of corporate governance which actually implements corporate governance. It's that component of corporate governance which is responsible, because these are people. Okay, so let's talk about them. What are they supposed to be like? Well, first of all, honest and transparent. That'd be a very good start. Okay, and sadly, unfortunately, sometimes we see this doesn't appear even in the very large companies. Integral to internal controls, risk management, agency, stakeholders, strategic management. All of these, as we've already seen, are part of the role of the board of directors. Also, just a reminder that the final responsibility for everything that happens inside the company is the responsibility of the board of directors. So your directors can't say, well, it wasn't me, it was Fred on the factory floor, and he made the mistake. Doesn't matter. As a director, you are responsible. Now, where do they get that responsibility and authority, by the way, to run the company from? They get it from the shareholders, who are the first investors, and who appoint the board of directors, and who can actually get rid of the board of directors if they're not happy with their performance and appoint somebody else. What else do we need to see on the board? Well, we need to see a balance of properly qualified executive directors. Okay, so not someone who's just come out of school or university sitting on the board of a large public company. Okay, that wouldn't be properly qualified. And your non-executive directors must be independent, because you will already know that the role of the non-executive directors is to make sure that stakeholder interests are protected and that the executive directors always behave in their stakeholders' best interests. Okay, so this is something called the agency problem that is sometimes faced by companies. Diversity of background and experience provides the best quality of decision making by the board of directors, and also the board of directors has to be a reasonable size. In other words, we want a variety of inputs from the board of directors to get the best quality of decisions way forward. On the other hand, we don't want so many directors that we can never get to a decision. We keep going around and around, so reasonable size. And of course, that is subjective, depends on the kind of company you are, how big you are, what sort of expertise you require on the board, and so on. Okay, but that is what a board should look like. Now, here you'll recognize, those of you who've seen my internal controls video, you'll recognize the same companies. Why? Well, because internal controls and bad corporate governance go hand in hand. So if your internal controls fail, then that reflects bad corporate governance, and all of these companies are companies that failed because of ineffective internal controls and therefore bad corporate governance or ineffective corporate governance. So what are the responsibilities on good corporate governance? Well, the directors need to be informed and support longer-term shareholder benefit. Okay, so remember, they're there for shareholder benefit and other stakeholders, but essentially the shareholders put them there and keep them there. They have to be clear on their roles, and they have to demonstrate integrity, so like transparency and honesty. There has to be a balance of skills, experience, and objectivity in the decisions that they make, and that's why diversity is so important on a board. And here we're talking about diversity of skills, experience, background, and so on, as well as more personal things such as your gender. But the decisions that the board needs to make is the blend of corporate objectives with values, business ethics as part of the strategy. So strategy is not only about the operational stuff and the money and the allocation of resources, but it's also about how does our strategy reflect our values? Are we being ethical in the way that we implement this? Because all of these, again, will impact the reputation of the organization and will also be the responsibility of the board. Proactive approach to managing risk. Now, for this, I would refer you to my other two videos in this series. So risk management and internal control systems, and there I go into a lot more detail about that. Alignment of the board, shareholders, and strategy to create sustainable value for all. Yep, okay, well that's very similar to point number one above. And protecting equal rights of shareholders. So even minority shareholders get a say in how the organization is run. And all of these come from the International Corporate Governance Network, which provide guidance on what good corporate governance should be able to do, what they should be aiming to do. Now, we know what the board of directors is now, or a little bit about them. What's a board committee? Well, a board committee is separate from the main board, although it is comprised predominantly of board members. And it's formed to carry out specific tasks that cannot be effectively carried out by the main board on its own. Okay, so as we shall see, for example, directors' remuneration is decided upon by the Remuneration Committee. And there is specialist expertise, and they are there only for one reason, to make sure that the remuneration that directors receive is fair and transparent. Okay, now if you've got the board involved with every single decision about remuneration, let alone risk or audit, and then they wouldn't have time to develop a strategy or implement that strategy. Okay. Other reasons why board committees are formed, well, because board doesn't have time, or because there is specialist subject matter that doesn't exist on the board. So, for example, an audit committee, I mean, this is unlikely, but one of the requirements of an audit committee is that you have a finance person, a qualified accountant, with up-to-date financial knowledge. Now, you'll probably find one of these on a board almost by definition, but let's say that there isn't one on the board, then the audit committee would bring in a specialist in this area. Or it might be that there are requirements or recommendations for you to have one of those committees. Okay, so if you're a publicly quoted company, then having an audit committee and a risk committee is very often recommended. It's a regulatory recommendation. And if you don't, I mean, you don't have to follow it, but if you don't follow it, then you do run the risk that other stakeholders are not going to buy your shares, or people aren't going to lend you money because they're not sure about your internal controls and your corporate governance. All right, so what are the main board committees? Now, please remember that board committees, there could be others. Companies could set up any committee they wanted. I mean, there was a past exam question which talked about the CEO wanting to set up a strategy committee, which, as you see, isn't on this list. But there's no reason why the board can't choose to do that and allocate responsibility to that committee for a specific task. But typically, you'll see a remuneration committee. We've already spoken about that. Nominations committee, which is which decides how board members are elected and puts people forward, right, to the board for selection of a new board member. So the nominations committee will make sure that there's no conflict of interest, all right, and that the new board member does bring something to the table, if you like, be it in terms of experience and so on. The risk committee, now very often this is part of the audit committee, but in a high-risk industry you may well have a committee that is dedicated to managing a risk. So if you're in oil exploration, for example, or nuclear energy production, then you will probably have a risk committee to make sure that everything is safe, all the risks have been attended to. And an audit committee entirely made up of independent non-executives. So these are, if you like, the watchdogs of both internal and external auditing activities. Okay, so internal, I'm talking about monitoring risk, monitoring internal controls. External, the audit committee will liaise with the external auditors and so on. Okay, and it really does give comfort to external stakeholders if an audit committee exists. All right. So what do we need to know to basically understand this topic and its place in SBL? First of all, why do we have corporate governance? We talked about that earlier, objectives, stakeholders, and so on. Okay, we need to understand that corporate governance, the board of directors, and the committees are part of the internal control system. Okay, so it's not that they connect with one another; they are part of each other. Okay, so remember the audit committee, for example, takes responsibility for the internal controls and making sure that they are met and monitored and up to date and all of those things. So it's part of the internal control system. You need to understand where the board of directors fits into this system, and it fits in terms of responsibility, okay, to making sure that internal controls are effective. You need to understand rights and responsibilities of executives and non-executives, so the fact that non-executives don't actually run the business, but they run the executive directors, if you like. They monitor the executive directors who do run the business. You need to know what the main committees are here, okay, as I've just described, so that's all, very well explained in your materials. And you need to know who sits on those committees. Why? Well, because very often you will be told about the composition of a committee, and there will be something wrong with it which you will be expected to pick up and comment on. So what are the related syllabus topics? Well, strategy, obviously, because it's the board of directors that develops the strategy. It's the non-executives that make sure that the strategy is in the best interests of the stakeholders. Stakeholder management, as we saw earlier, that was a fundamental part of the job of corporate governance, right at the beginning of this video. Risk management, we've spoken about that, and internal controls, but that's also, of course, a separate topic in SBL, but you have to remember that in SBL everything is integrated. You'll never get a question that's only on one topic. So a question on corporate governance, could easily incorporate in your answer, a discussion of risk management and strategy, or internal controls, or culture. Remember that the board of directors actually are the ones that set the culture. People follow them. So if the board of directors behaves in a way that is not transparent, that is dishonest, then that is what the rest of the organization will do. And so they have a responsibility for behaving in transparent and honest ways and making that kind of behavior the norm in their organization, thereby determining the culture of the organization. And finally, agency. Remember that the board of directors are agents, or the directors are agents of the shareholders who put them there. Okay? In other words, they should always act in the best interests of their shareholders. And also there's a discussion about the agency problem. The point I'm trying to make is agency is a separate topic in SBL, but of course intimately connected with corporate governance. And of course there are ACCA study materials, and this is the contents page of the workbook that is produced by the ACCA, which covers the syllabus. And I put all of these chapters here, and there is another slide actually of chapters following this one, which shows the overlap between corporate governance and all of these areas. So, for example, professionalism, ethics, public interest is about looking after your stakeholders, including the community. Corporate reporting, it's about reporting to external stakeholders on the performance of the organization. Yes, the board of directors has the obligation to make sure that the reports are truthful, reliable, and so on. Okay, so it's the whole thread of corporate governance runs through all of these chapters. In fact, I would say runs through the whole of the syllabus. And we see some more here on the next slide. Strategic choices, as I've already said. Strategy is developed by the board of directors. Risk is managed by the board of directors. And all of this is the responsibility of the board of directors. Now, typically, the topic is examined in two ways. Either you're told the composition of the board or the committees and you're expected to identify an error or a weakness, or you're expected to explain the role of the composition of the board, or even a committee. Okay, in other words, what do the people on there do? What is their job? And are the people at the moment doing that job or not? So, for example, if they tell you in the case study or in one of the exhibits that, one of the directors is not being transparent, then you would say, well, I'm sorry, but he or she is not meeting the expectations of their role. Now, as I say, corporate governance is something that is an integral part of many parts of the syllabus, and so you could talk about it in answers to different topics. However, occasionally you will get a task which is specifically about corporate governance, and here is an example. And we see part 1, explain the key roles of non-executive directors, right, and assess the importance to courgettes of having a diverse board. So you'd be talking about things like better quality of decisions, greater variety of perceptions that they bring to the table, challenge to the norm, if you like, if you have a diverse board, and all of those things. Okay, so this is required to be presented in a slide format. So you have 2 slides which you need to present, each and one on each of those. Okay, so roles of non-executives, but in that company. So it's not a theoretical question, but specifically in that company, what are their roles? And secondly, why is it important to have a diverse board in that company? Really, really important. You remember this. SBL is not an academic subject. And sadly, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you found it of value, and you understand now how corporate governance and board committees fit in to the SBL syllabus.